It's May 15, 2006, and I'm talking to Marian Leighton Levy by telephone. Marian's of Rounder Records.
Reviewing your email a little bit.
Okay.
And
hey, can I first interject something? I've got all these rules now because I've got new corporate masters or university masters.
Right.
I am tape recording you. Do you know this?
Well, I do now.
You do now, and is it acceptable to you?
Of course.
And I can use this interview in my book?
Yes, of course.
All right.
You may.
Thank you. Okay. This is I'm being lawyered to death, and since I'm a lawyer, it's kind of disconcerting.
It's understood, isn't it?
No, it's disconcerting.
I bet.
But anyway, go on. I feel like this is an interview in which you could kind of handle it yourself, and I like that. So, because you already kind of know, we have sort of one very broad topic, but you clearly have thoughts about it. So,
well, I have. On the other hand, you had some too. So what I tried to do is most of the ones that you had were actually much easier to sort of respond to. So that's the reason that I was trying to hark back to that. I do remember that one of the things you mentioned was something about being Ken's girlfriend, but
sure.
Right. And the interesting thing about that is I don't think that. Well, it was such a relatively short time after we started Rounder.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't think most people even realize that. So that's easily enough responded to. I mean,
right.
I scarcely think that unless Ken's wife, Donna, who likes to keep a picture around for some odd reason, and it's me, the Carl Fleischauer photograph. And aside from that, I don't think people most of the time even knew, because Ken and I met the summer after my
freshman year, right?
Freshman year in college, and I think we broke up, officially, even though we all continued to live in the same house, within the first 2 years after we started Rounder.
Yeah, but Bill told me, and I don't know if that it was hard, and that the things kept intruding, although you might have been broken up.
Well,
he said it was Ken. He said Ken was worse than you, but
well, yes, and but Ken was actually pretty good about the way he dealt with it was mostly by being on the road.
Okay.
So he went down and did his first trip to record Cajun music during that time. And it was a period when the business was, really just getting underway in a lot of respects.
Right.
So it was not quite, we didn't have as many extra workers around. I think we hired our first person sometime close to that period, but we were still doing other things as well. So it's interesting Bill would remember it that way, because he was, of course, gone most of the time at school because he was teaching as much as he was doing Rounder work.
Right.
Whereas Ken was the one doing mostly Rounder work, and I was doing my first stint as a grad student during that period. So most days I was also off at school.
Yeah. Now, did you ultimately get a master's degree from Northeastern?
Yes.
Okay. And that's in European
Modern
history,
European history.
Okay.
And my next one is all done except for the thesis.
Cool.
So hopefully, and I think I have between now, I know I have between now and June of 2007.
This is in, my memory served me, I mentioned it in the book. Is this theology or comparative literature? What do I?
It's literature.
Literature.
I must have. If they had comparative literature, I probably would have done that, because I think it's a very cool field. But no, it's American and English literature, and in fact, it's very related to what we're talking about. So that's why I've done lots of thinking about this topic, so that it's very easy. I mean, it's very difficult to answer because I've thought so much about it.
I would really prefer that you do it in your terms and not necessarily terms I sketched out. That's infinitely more interesting, and it reflects you. I mean, that's what.
Well, you see, the interesting thing too is the thesis I'm working on is two women from very similar backgrounds and almost the same age as I am.
Okay.
Dorothy Allison and Carolyn Chute, and they're both from rural poor backgrounds.
Okay.
And one is from Maine, the rural poor, like me, and one is from South Carolina, the rural poor, Dorothy Allison, who wrote Bastard Out of Carolina, and Carolyn Chute, who wrote The Beans of Egypt, Maine.
Okay.
And both of whom I think are fairly extreme people, and that's something that, because of having done, and the way I'm approaching two particular books by them is gender, sexuality, and class.
Mm-hmm.
So I've thought a lot about it, and I've done a lot of reading in the last couple of months in particular about not so much working class, because if you're rural poor, a lot of the time you're not even working class. In fact, you're just sort of scraping by, doing whatever work is available, which sometimes is seasonal,
right,
like where I grew up. But very seldom is it like being in a regular kind of job, with certainly not anything with union benefits and stuff like that.
Right.
So, and the other thing too, it's interesting in terms of the reading. A lot of the reading I've been doing that has caused me to think a lot about this is that there's a lot of there are now starting to be actually working class studies departments. And so people are actually doing it from a non-Marxist perspective, which when I was an undergraduate, of course, nobody did.
Yeah.
And we know how resistant Americans are to thinking in terms of class. And gender, which is what, of course, you raised as the topic. Interestingly enough, a lot of people sort of now are taking this kind of approach of what would they call intersectionality, in other words, that you can't really separate them. And I think that that's very true in terms of gender, class, and sex, in particular. So, and that, interestingly enough, too, there's a lot of beginning work, not a lot of conclusive work, but beginning work about how education itself, and the higher you go educationally, the truer this is very shot through with middle-class values. And so you often have this feeling that you're kind of passing, that you're sort of passing as someone else, but you've had to sort of leave your past behind, and you feel sometimes a little bit like a traitor, where like you've betrayed where you came from. And I think that this is also something that is very familiar to me in terms of my gender in the record business, because particularly when we started Rounder, there were very few women, certainly in the position of being owners, record company presidents, or involved in positions of A&R authority.
Right.
There were quite a few women in the field of publicity.
Okay.
And shortly after we started the sort of publicity and promotion area, which was a little while after we'd started putting records out, like I would say maybe as long as 4 years after we'd started putting records out, that kind of became my special area. Just the way Bill's was more things that had to do with finances and contracts, and Ken's had more to do with just bluegrass production, basically. As the years went by, I was also a little bit more involved in some of the blues A&R.
Right.
But all three of us, of course, were equally involved in A&R in the sense that we've all equally been involved in making the A&R decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty unusual at the time we started. The only person I remember who really impressed me, I think I might have mentioned this to you, was Karen Berg from Warner Brothers, and she actually did have signing authority at Warner Brothers at that time.
That was in the early 70s? You haven't mentioned it in the past, okay.
Yeah, and that's early to mid-70s.
Okay.
And that was, that has changed a great deal since that time, but that was very, very unique back then, and she was really inspirational. I actually got to meet her and was on a panel, I think, with her at a college radio convention at one point. But in terms of and so how do you manage? How did I manage as a woman in the record business?
Well, one thing that came... Well, go ahead.
Mostly male.
Yeah.
And that's going back to what I was saying before, the question of passing. I think that in terms of gender, if you stop and think of gender as being an important part of it being class and sexuality in general. That they're all inseparable one from the other. Another part of that is that you're very accustomed to the notion. In fact, you just live with it, and I was never even conscious of it, but I always assumed that identity is something that is fluid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that if I'm one of the boys when I'm on the road with Ken and Bill, or with musicians in a band, or courting a band, you know, as a woman, and all the guys in the band all the band members are guys, then you know the kinds of things that you're supposed to do to be taken seriously, and that is to be one of the boys. Granted, you have more authority because you're a signing person.
Okay, yeah.
But that's what I mean in terms of there are many identities,
Sure.
depending on what you're doing. And certainly the record business at that point in time, that was one of the ways that, you know, I learned to cope and feel comfortable. And it was something that was not all that difficult for me because I had somewhat of a tomboy identity when I was growing up. I was also studious and got good grades and all of that, and was the valedictorian of my class, but I was also a kind of a loner and also kind of a tomboy and alienated and dying to escape the background that I came from.
But that might have been easy. I mean, Ken and Bill were also, they didn't fit some stereotype of the boys either. I mean, they I think, I gather, were studious. They got into Tufts and got out in 4 years. And Ken certainly I don't think of as carrying with him an aura of being one of the boys, as that might be said in quotation marks. He seems quite different from...
in a sense, and don't get me wrong, when I say one of the boys, I don't think there's anything really wrong with that, frankly.
Oh, no, I'm not...
But the other thing is, and this is where gender is inseparable from class, I'm the only one who's from a lower class background. And they are definitely middle class boys.
There are ways in which I could imagine you relating better to some of the Southern musicians you encountered than Ken.
Yes.
Who very much is, and I grew up all around them, he's a New York Jewish guy.
Yeah.
I mean,
yes, and this was also true with many of our blues artists. I never actually suffered from white liberal guilt.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I did not grow up with money. I was a scholarship student in college, and I was very happy to be a student in college, and I was keenly aware that if I weren't a student in college, I'd probably be making my living in a factory because I would have made a lousy waitress.
Sure.
And there weren't a lot of other options. So I thought, wow, this is a pretty darn good job.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not something that was expected of me. I was the first one in my family to go to college. And so it was a very, very different thing. And even though Ken and Bill don't fit, and most men who were involved in the counterculture, which we all three were, didn't fit sort of the normal kind of cultural stereotypes of the typical American male.
Right.
On the other hand, there's no question that Ken felt a great deal of pressure from his father to be quote-unquote successful.
Okay.
I think that both Ken and Bill have very different relationships to their work that are both class and gender influenced. I never was the kind of workaholic, for example, that both Ken and Bill would, they are self-confessed workaholics.
Right.
And I also never was as self-identified with my work, either from an ego standpoint or just in terms of it being all-consuming.
But do you see that as an outgrowth of gender identity?
Gender and class.
Both, okay.
Yes. I mean, I always knew that you work in order to live, not that you live in order to work. I think that is much more of a middle-class value, and I think it's much more of a male value, with it, of course, being influenced, as I said, by class, because, of course, women who are professionally driven and ambitious and so forth are that way as much as, say, a male would be. But I do think that is partly the fact that, values concerning success and how we define success are so shot through with middle-class values.
Right.
The fear of falling, the need to save money, the need to be dispassionate, the need to be objective, and, God forbid that you make mistakes or, in the words of, I was just reading this wonderful book about hard country music, wrong's what I do best. I mean, that would be like the antithesis of a middle-class approach to work.
Right.
Whereas I always found it rather amusing, and at one point I had a sort of sign on my desk saying, "Just blame me," and I would just sort of chuckle about it. Ken and I actually, in particular, used to do this because Bill was so perfectionistic, and we'd say, just blame me. But I always got a kick out of some of that stuff as opposed to taking it quite as seriously.
Now, when you guys divided into a loose division of responsibility in the mid-'70s, and you moved into promotion and publicity, did you feel empowered because there were other women there, or did you feel you were segregating yourselves into the women's work? Because you said that was one area where there were visible women in record industries. So,
Again,
was that a positive thing, or was it somehow that you weren't doing the business end like Bill was, say?
No, I wouldn't have been interested in doing that.
Okay.
I would have long since been out of the record business if I had to be devoted to numbers and contracts. But
did you think it was the women's job that you were taking on the women's job?
I didn't, and actually I had a similar kind of feeling about that as I did when we started Rounder, in terms of what Rounder represented in the record business, for that matter.
Uh-huh.
I felt the same way about the role I was playing in the publicity world, which is that I was, someone who was the antithesis of the sort of designer-clothed, well-coiffed, well-made-up, hostess-like definition of the publicist,
right.
Which back in those days was a real, that was kind of the role that publicists were more often than not supposed to play. And that wasn't just true of the entertainment world or the record business. And so my inspiration, and I always had a great deal of fun with sort of, exploding that particular stereotype by being just the way Ken and Bill and I were as a record company, which is blue jean clad and,
right.
Often T-shirted and long-haired and knowing what I was talking about and being there because I had a mission.
Right.
I was there because I believed in what I was doing, as opposed to, most publicists are basically hired guns, the same as radio promo guys were back then. They were the hired guns were the men in the radio promotion end of things, and the women were the hired guns in the publicity end of things.
Right.
But the reason I loved it also is simply because it was an area that involved words.
Okay.
As much as it involved music, it involved words, and that's always been important to me. And giving voice to people whose voices are largely musical was something that was very exciting. How do you translate that? And as much as possible, I tried to do it by getting hints from the musicians themselves, but at the same time understanding that not all musicians are that verbally articulate, so therefore some translation would have to take place between publicist and public.
Okay.
And so yes, I've always loved that, and I mean that's still what I do in many ways.
Sure.
Except that it's not just at Rounder now; it's also in my thesis and in other ways. I'm going to do a piece for a book about hard country music, about bluegrass as it's about alternative country music, and it's about bluegrass as a kind of the country cousin of alternative country music, which is sort of similar to what I've always done.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to grapple at, and it may be that there's no clear answer, but did you've talked to me about being involved in consciousness-raising sessions in college. You were there kind of at the dawn of the second wave feminist movement, this 1970 feminist movement, or 68, 69, 70. I'm assuming that had to play some role in your perception of Rounder as a political project, which you've all talked about. Ken to a lesser degree. Ken has actually said at some point, no, I was just interested in the music, but he goes back and forth. But you and Bill have certainly talked about Ken as at Rounder as a political project.
Yes, and I think there's unquestionably, not only in the beginning were all three of us involved in it, but as time went on, it's not that any of the three of us became less involved in it. We just became a little bit more involved in defining for us individually what it meant, and it therefore took slightly different shape, perhaps, in each of us. But for me, unquestionably, the music that we primarily dealt with back then and represented as a record company back then was an area of music that was very counter to the mainstream.
Right.
And that was something that was very important to me in terms of my sort of radical feminist consciousness. And it still is a part of, and that is still very much what my sort of larger intellectual project is anything that is non-mainstream and that, in a way, simply by surviving is almost subversive to the mainstream. Mm-hmm. Now, when Ken and I were in Ithaca when Ken was finishing up his coursework, because of course he's ABD. Right. We were both involved in SDS, and at that time the women's groups were just starting to break away from the male left for very similar reasons to what I might have felt within Rounder, except that within Rounder things were defined, at least structurally, very equally. Right. And in particular in the beginning. So I didn't have the same problems within Rounder that most women who were members of the left did with larger leftist groups, including me.
Right.
And so it was very exciting to me when Ken and I were finished with living in Ithaca. And at that point, the three of us, Ken, Bill, and I, had all decided we would live communally at Bill's apartment in Somerville.
Right. And
part of the reason that was so exciting to me is that was the beginning of the Women's Center in Cambridge. And it was in a women's consciousness raising group. And and Boston, very definitely, Cambridge was a major center for thinking, writing, intellectual activism, and theoretical work within the larger movement. Not unlike in the 19th century, a similar sort of role that Boston played, although it was probably a little more middle class, I think. But Cambridge was definitely more radical than New York, and the sort of the Ms. Magazine axis of the women's movement in the late 60s and early 70s.
Did you ever think about the need to record women artists, or the desire to do that? I mean, were you conscious of those things?
And indeed, all three of us felt that way. I mean, in fact, Ken and I, there were a couple of women folk singers who were doing protest music as well as kind of early women's movement music, more from a kind of a folk background, even when we were in Ithaca. And there was a woman in Ithaca that we first heard and tried to do a record of, and she kind of, went deconstructed or went off and did something else. But then it was shortly after we were all three living together in Rounder. And frankly, Ken and Bill, there's no question, were absolutely as excited about women's music.
Right.
I mean, in fact, in many ways more so. Because, I mean, even back then, in my opinion, the most radical music is the music that in many ways is not specifically polemical or self-consciously rhetorical.
Okay.
Which often is not very good music.
Yeah.
As well as kind of, it's a whole nother thing than music.
Right.
It's almost sort of like singing, a political manifesto or something.
Sure.
Which, from the standpoint of what I theoretically thought of as the important thing about the music we were doing, was not as exciting to me. The women's movement beginnings of that. Plus, a lot of women were really just learning to play their instruments back then.
Yes.
So that made it also not very exciting music.
Right. Did you ever, when you were down south with them at, I don't know, I'm trying to, at Union Grove in the early days, which I guess, you were there as it was turning, and you said to me at one point that you found that to be a difficult environment when it became inundated
but it
with
was
bikers
not because
and
of being in the South. It was the hippiness of it.
Okay.
I actually did, as you were saying, have an easy rapport with many of the quote-unquote authentic folk, meaning people who were real country people. Like I remember a very interesting example of that is when Ken Bill, because the three of us did travel every summer from starting in my either junior or senior year of college.
Okay.
And at that point, I think Ken had been to Union Grove twice, and Bill had maybe been once. So, most of the, and we went, the three of us, together, I think in the spring of '69, to Union Grove and to Galax at the same time. And that was my initial exposure to both of those places. And frankly, most of the sort of folk revival and kind of hippie-ish elements of folk festivals and bluegrass festivals and blues festivals and old-time string band conventions and so forth were the least interesting parts of it.
Right.
And the part that interested me most really was, in fact, the same thing that interested Ken and Bill, which is actually going out and interviewing people like Steve Ledford. And the example I was going to mention is when we were near Pipestem, West Virginia, we went to interview the daughter, I believe, of blind Alfred Reed. And it turned out she's, as many country people are, born-again Christian. I mean, I'm a born-again Christian, too. I was. As a girl growing up, I was more religious than my parents, in fact.
Right.
So I not only knew the lingo and had been the president of my Baptist Youth Fellowship and the president of the Girls Guild at church and attended the adult Bible study group, and I taught Sunday school and all of that. So I knew and had memorized, of course, large portions of the Bible. And so this woman, as we're standing at the door after interviewing her and getting ready to go, unsurprisingly to me, but completely blindsiding Bill, puts on her Witnessing for the Lord hat and starts saying things like, and of course it's my earnest wish that everybody will accept the Lord Jesus Christ into their heart as their Lord and Savior. And Bill is like, oh, what the hell is she talking about?
Did she mean right then and there?
And Bill's nodding his head, like thinking, I really don't know. I guess I'll just be polite here because I certainly wouldn't want to offend somebody.
Right.
And he starts nodding his head, at which point she grabs his hands and she said, oh, I'm so happy. Does that mean you're ready to accept the Lord? And Bill is like, and I sort of intervened. I think Bill remembers this story quite well, too. And I intervened and quoted, I think, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 or something like that. And she said, oh, I see. So you actually do know. Oh, well, you want... I mean, it was sort of like that let us off the hook.
Yeah.
Oh, someone who can quote the Bible, the New Testament, chapter and verse, is clearly someone who must have accepted Jesus.
Right.
And so then she said, oh, well, it's lovely to meet you all, blah, blah, blah. And we got out of there really quickly. But Bill was like, what was going on? What was that all about? And I said, Bill, she thought you were ready to be converted. And he's like, really? That's what was going on? Because, of course, it was completely outside of his purview, having been brought up as a Unitarian, as a Unitarian.
Right.
In liberal Lexington, Massachusetts.
Well, when you were growing up, you have talked to me in the past about a time or two that you mentioned, and maybe it was all the time, but you've spoken of a time or two at which there was tension between you and your parents as you, because of your cultural aspirations, educational aspirations, perhaps. Did you ever feel that they saw limitations because you were a female, and that they thought those were appropriate?
No, it was the other way around.
Okay.
And the actual, and a lot of the conflict in terms of my relationship with my parents was that, in fact, they gave me a sense, which I think is not true in middle-class girls. And the more I read about some of the more I read about socialization of middle-class versus not just lower-class but rural poor girls, and there have been some done by, just finished reading this wonderful book, if you weren't interested at all, called This Changes Everything. And it's about relational psychology and how that changed, how it revolutionized the field of psychology, but how it also brought democracy into our personal lives. And a lot of Carol Gilligan, for example, at Harvard, Jean Baker Miller at Wellesley, and then, of course, Judith Lewis Herman, who wrote, basically was the one who coined the post-traumatic stress disorder, PSD, and ran the Women's Mental Health Project in Somerville at just about the same time we were starting Rounder. Anyhow, a lot of what they found with girls, as opposed to boys, that boys tend to become the little man that they're supposed to become at a much earlier time in their childhood development than girls do. But girls, and again, it's going back to what we were talking about before in terms of the fluidity and multiplicity, how multiple identity is. Girls learn to be what they are supposed to be in given situations, but it doesn't mean that there's this other whole deeper part goes away completely. But with middle-class girls in particular, a big part of their socialization is what some of the relational psychologists have referred to as the tyranny of nice and good. And the tyranny of nice and good, when you get around to interviewing adolescent girls, they'll often say, the interviewer will ask them about something, and they'll say, well, do you want me to tell you what I think, or do you want to know what I really think? Right. And this kind of dual identity, I think, is something that is very typical of middle class, of girls generally. Lower class girls also, though, have a different relationship to anger because of the fact that the tyranny of nice and good isn't quite as strong at as early an age, and that was definitely true in my experience. But anger, in fact, plays a very creative role, and it helps you with separating from the world that you grew up in. It's a way that you deal with conflict and try to sort of work through it as opposed to brushing it under the rug. Anyhow, my parents always made me feel that I could do anything a boy could do.
Okay.
But I wasn't really supposed to go out and do it.
So I was thinking that, but did they want you to do that?
They wanted me to do that, but at the same time, the tricky part is, particularly if you're from the lower class, you deal with so much shame because of being poor and people rejecting you and making you feel, that you're inferior. And so then suppose your kid does grow up and leave. Does that mean that they are now like the people who make you feel lower class? That, in other words, you're rejecting them.
Right.
So it was very hard. That was a lot what the conflict was about, and I just sort of dealt with it by saying, I have to do what I have to do, and that's it. I made a complete break, and this is my life now, and, I go home a couple times a year. But then a big part of my rebellion during that period of time, too, was political as well.
Right.
And, even middle-class families, let alone lower-class families, were split in many cases because of people's attitudes toward the Vietnam War, and that was definitely true in my family.
Right.
So at a certain point, my mother said to me that as long as I believed the things that I did, that I shouldn't come home because I was going to corrupt my younger brothers and sister. I was the oldest of four.
Now, I know your dad's passed away. Is your mother still alive? She was when we last spoke. Okay, but your dad lived many years into Rounder. What did they come to? How did they come to view it and what you were doing?
They really didn't view it in any way at all because
Is that right?
They didn't really understand it.
Did they see records
again,
and know this was you?
It's partly a class difference. Ken's father, once we started getting records reviewed in the New York Times, then it was like, oh, well, maybe you really are doing something.
Okay.
My mother would usually say, well, how is everything going, Sissy? And I would tell her how things were going, and she'd say, well, that's nice, dear. And eventually I realized that I could have told her almost anything short of, well, I had a heart attack last week and I'm going to die next week.
Right.
That she would have said, oh, well, that's nice, dear, about anything. I could sort of see her eyes glaze over.
Oh, God.
And that wasn't, I have to say, that was not only, I frankly prefer that to Ken's relation, the kind of pressure he got from his father.
Okay.
It left me free.
So did your father ever get it? Did he ever see Rounder as something
No.
Interesting? Okay.
No.
But would it have been the same if one of his sons had started it? I guess it would have been the same reaction. Huh?
It would have been exactly the same.
Interesting. Okay.
They live where they live, and their world is not unlike, say, the world of Estill and Orna Ball.
Okay.
When they recorded them. The outside world is interesting, and maybe they like to hear about it, but in a way it doesn't exist.
Did it matter to them that you were supporting yourself and living off of whatever you were doing allowed you to feed yourself, and wasn't that good?
They always, people survive.
And they knew you'd survive, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And people survive to differing degrees, and it was all kind of a mystery to my parents.
Interesting. And your mother, to this day, the press has gotten so much greater, and there's been profiles of you guys and stuff. Does she any of that?
My mom doesn't read things like Newsweek or the New York Times or things like that. Every now and then she'll, someone will mention that they heard something about Rounder Records, and she'll mention that to me. But it's not anything that ever did or would or will loom large in her consciousness, and I'm frankly happy about that. I would not like to have to be Marian Rounder 99% of my life.
Okay. Well, how about other men in the business? As you have said that women were but there was a role for them largely in the fields of publicity. But you were an owner, and you were an A&R person in that capacity. But more importantly, you were an owner. You were I don't know to what extent this was projected to the outside world, or if people just dealt with whoever they dealt with, but you were the equal of Ken and Bill. Did you ever get a reaction? Were you, the corollary to the, what did you call it, the tyranny of the nice and good is often that, very commonly women who break away from that are bitches, or worse. There's other bad words.
Well, that was one of the nice things about being in the record business.
Okay.
I suspect that happens more in the business world.
It sure happened in law.
In the record business, I have to... Pardon?
It sure happened in law.
Yeah, I would expect it in business and law and things like that.
Right.
But our world, and it was a little world when we started, I have to say that probably overall it was an advantage in terms of the business. And I was certainly perceived as Ken's and Bill's equal. And in fact, see, you didn't know us during the time that we were doing a lot of work in New Orleans and Memphis, but a lot of the black artists liked dealing with me because of the fact that I am a woman.
Okay.
And even some of the bluegrass artists. I remember years afterwards, Jerry Douglas making some comment to me like, "Oh, Marian, whenever you came into the studio when I was recording with J.D. and Ricky, it would be like, oh, Marian is here." It would be like I was this sort of cute little hippie girl, and that in a way sounds like it's a kind of diminishing or whatever, but it's not, because music is a sexy thing.
Okay.
So the little bit of chemistry, unless you're the kind of person who gets involved with the people that you're working with, which I didn't, and Ken and Bill didn't, for the most part. I mean, we did have from time to time, but, and of course I ultimately did marry a musician, but for the most part we didn't. And so it was like just, and the other thing is that there was the feeling, even though of course it's the cultural stereotype, that a woman is going to be a little more sensitive, that she's a little more emotive, that she'll get music in a way that men don't, because men are much more intellectual, distanced, nuanced, and so forth. And that a woman, when she smiles, it lights up the room, whereas when a man smiles, he's like counting dollar signs or something.
So that business about getting the music more, do you think you could sense that in musicians, including some of these what I would perceive as hardcore Southerners?
Oh, yes.
Who would feel sort of an empathy from you?
Yes, definitely.
Interesting.
Yes, definitely. And the other thing is that, anyone who worked with us over a longer period of time did have some sense that I was kind of, yes, I'm sophisticated and I'm educated and I'm from the North, but that I'm also from the country.
Uh-huh. That I can see. I'm intrigued by the earlier remark because it's a fascinating concept, because it suggests that there's something almost feminine about the idea of making music, that there's a femininity to doing that.
Well, and I will tell you that with minority music in particular, I think that's true.
Really?
I mean, I sort of have my own little feelings, which someday I may try to explore a little bit more and try to put into words and on paper, about bluegrass in particular, for all of its macho-ness in certain ways and macho posturing in certain ways, is a very feminized music. And that's in fact why certain types of macho are so almost clung to, because it's like, well, we have to be that way. We can't let people know that we're really so feminized.
Well, are you talking about, there's a stereotype when you talk about bluegrass lyrics or old-time music. So, home, hearth, mother, church, faith, and all of those sound like feminine things that are feminine values.
Well, and not only that, but that they're outside the mainstream.
Okay.
And that somehow, of course, in the world of country music, bluegrass for a long time was kind of looked down upon.
Okay.
The same is true for blues within the world of black music, of black pop music. That it's the people who play bluegrass aren't educated, and they're dumb hillbillies and rednecks. And that's a very feminized place to be.
Okay.
And the same is true in blues. You don't want to like blues too much if you're black, because it means that you're probably from poor, uneducated background. And the instant you can afford to live in the suburbs or have enough money to buy nice clothes and a nice car, you don't want to be accused of, being one of those raggedy-ass people who like blues.
Right.
And that's the reason that, of course, white people, and for the most part middle-class people, are the ones who saved and kept both bluegrass and blues alive for a long time.
Sure. And Ken and Bill were never a problem, I take it, even subconsciously, unconsciously. They were always comfortable with your role. Did you guys ever strategize, I guess, where I'm going, when a woman might be better to step forward?
Never.
Okay.
I mean, and in fact, I would probably be the one who would be more likely to do that than Ken or Bill. Ken or Bill tended, they really are very democratic with a small d.
Right.
I was more aware of sort of psychological or emotional or ethical nuances.
Right.
And I remember at one point George Thorogood saying, referring to me as, how was it he put it, that I'm the soul of Rounder. And I'm like, what are you talking about, George? Because all three of us were we all traveled with the Destroyers. We were close to them, so it wasn't like he was saying something like, oh, you're my best buddy or something.
Right.
But it was, he said, you're the one who's going to think about the ethics and what is the right way to do things from a moral standpoint. And that is true. I sometimes did wind up being in that position, although I have to say that often Ken did too.
Uh-huh.
Although Ken tended, I think, to becoming a little more of the time from a place of kind of romanticizing the music and white liberal guilt. That's one of the things I was going to say, is from my background, I never really was all that prone to white liberal guilt. I never understood it also, and therefore I never really was someone who could sort of be played. And when you're dealing with blues musicians and bluegrass musicians, there are some people who know, if you're white and you're from the North and privileged, that you can play that card a little bit.
Right.
But so there were times, as I say, when either Ken or I particularly, but I think more often I, because of being a woman, would sort of be regarded as someone who could be counted on to understand something other than business or dollars and cents realities, and I didn't mind playing that role.
Right. Now, we've talked a lot about, we've used the early 70s as a frame of reference for a lot of this discussion, and it was the counterculture time and a very politicized time in many ways. But, Rounder, of course, endured far beyond that. I try and spend a lot of time talking about the 90s, when you went through lots of distribution angst, other kinds of angst. You were, entering partnerships vis-a-vis distribution. Things were, you'd form them, things would come apart. There was a lot of change there, but it was another world. It wasn't 1974 anymore.
Well, and not only that, but by that time, to go back to, the personal being political or the personal being business, the three of us all were living very separate lives, too, by that time.
Right.
We all had our own homes. Bill married during that period. I married a couple of years before.
Right.
Bill did, had AJ. Bill had his son. And I think it was really during that period that there was a lot of testing of the partnership in many ways, because we all did have much more separate lives than we did back in the 70s and even well into the 80s.
Right.
From my point, it for the most part, we still continue to operate from consensus. On the other hand, Ken and Bill, because of the fact that they were always much more completely personally identified with their work, there were many times that if I disagreed with them, not only would I give in because I'm one person out of three, but I also didn't really care that much. I really didn't see it as going to be the end of the world one way or the other.
Okay.
And the other, of course, difference is by 1988, I had AJ.
Right.
And fortunately, I was 40 years old when I had him. Rounder was well established. I was really able to make him my first priority.
Right.
And I did. I was very happy to do that. And I didn't let anything come between that commitment, and including Rounder. And so there were times, because of course Bill, even though he and Ileana had Emmett not too long after that, did have a full-time person who wasn't working.
Right, sure.
To look after Emmett,
yeah.
Whereas I was being a Rounder partner, a mother, and by the time my son started school, was a single mother.
Right.
We weren't divorced until a few years after that, but there was no co-parenting going on.
Sure.
So there definitely were times then that I felt a great deal of conflict, and I did feel a lot of pressure from Ken and Bill that I should be a different kind of partner than the one that I was. But I just put my foot down, and even though that was very, it did cause a lot of conflict.
You mean just more physically present and involved in day-to-day business affairs?
Well, that I wasn't willing to put in the same number of hours.
Right. Sure. Okay.
Yep.
That's a very classic
yes.
women's conundrum.
Exactly.
When they,
yep.
In terms
of course, the main difference was that I was one of the partners, so unless it's written down that each of the partners is supposed to be spending X number of hours per week doing this, then there was really nothing to force me to do it.
Right.
Except intense pressure and a lot of conflict and harsh judgments and so forth, many of which I did feel. At that point, Ken and Bill really weren't the same kind of... They didn't understand things in the way they had back in the late 60s and early 70s, let's just put it that way.
Well, when, if ever, this is a question I'm thinking of, I should have asked about 5 years ago, when, if ever, did you guys create a partnership agreement?
Well, our partnership agreement never covered things like that.
Okay.
So there have been a couple of attempts at it, and there is a partnership structure. I mean, obviously we incorporated.
Yes.
And then we did had to, for legal reasons, have some buyout things in case of the death of any of us and so forth. So we do have all of that,
right.
But we don't have any partnership agreement that specifies roles, what people are required to do.
Okay.
So we basically evolved a kind of understanding that in terms of being responsible owners, that more and more of our time would be taken up with administrative issues, and we all three have risen to the occasion to do that, and that we would continue, all three of us, to be equally involved in A&R meetings and A&R decisions, which we all do. But that beyond that, in terms of attending music conventions, in terms of amounts of traveling and so forth, that's wildly varied over the years.
Sure. Now, when tensions were arising in the early 90s with respect to, your role as a mother and a single mother, did Ken and Bill ever seem constrained by their own male guilt, white liberal male guilt, or liberal male guilt?
Not at all, no.
Okay.
Because, of course, all three of us, when we started Rounder, it was such a mission, and it remains such a mission, and still is. But then how do you define mission? It seemed to me, as the years went by, that their sense of mission was equivalent to workaholism.
Yes.
And I never had been a workaholic.
Yeah, and early in the conversation, I want to make sure I get this right. I'm glad you returned to it, because early in our conversation, I think that you might have identified that absence of workaholism, this idea that you were going to live a life that was more total, more complete, more all-encompassing than just Rounder. I think you kind of linked that with femininity or feminine values at all. Did I hear you correctly in that?
Well, to some degree, I think you have to be a little careful in the sense that, and of course I'm the one who's saying this, except that I want to be clear that I never have thought of gender as having some sort of essentialist definition. I don't think that there's something that is feminine inherently or masculine inherently. But I think the fact
But culture places these things on us.
Well, but I think that the other thing is that in relation to what we're talking about, women in particular grow up with multiple identities because of the fact that we do many different things.
Okay.
I mean, a woman goes and works, but then she has to take care of her home. She has children to raise. She, gives birth to children.
Okay.
So yes, those are culturally, but the end result is that I think women are much more open to understanding themselves as doing many different things in the course of a lifetime, much more easily than, at least in my experience, of middle-class men.
Right.
Do, and in particular not defining yourself totally in terms of being successful at work.
Right. Going outside the partnership, when business took a different turn, business, when you were involved with Universal and, forming REP, forming DNA, then ultimately getting involved with Universal. And I don't know to what extent you were in the forefront of all of that, because the times...
Well, all three of us actually did have always been so looked at as the total package of what Rounder is, and all three of us were involved in it.
So no sense then, or did you sense then any resentment because you were a woman? Now, of course, I'm mindful of the fact that this was the 1990s, and there'd been a lot of cultural water under the bridge and a lot of change about women's roles. But I'm just wondering if you ever did perceive that at all, even
No,
in a different
I will
stage.
say that overall in the record business, in terms of the larger picture, I have more often perceived it as ridiculously to me, because I am not someone who believes that women versus men, that either, I mean, I don't see women as superior. In fact, I do know men who are liberal men who seem to feel that women are more superior than I do. I don't think either men or women are. But I will say that in the record business overall, there is some sense often that a woman is not going to cheat you as much. She's going to be better ethically. And she's going to be more honest to deal with. And she won't stab you in the back. Particularly if you have authority and self-confidence and are secure, that you could trust a woman more than you can a man. So I'm not saying that I feel that way, but I did feel that that was often the perception. Now, I will say that Ken and Bill, they actually had more difficulty with quote-unquote partnerships, meaning the concept of even being a partner, always have had more problems with that than I did, to such a degree that, in fact, I kind of basically opted out and took a back seat in some of our partnerships once they were formed, because Ken and Bill were having such a difficult time and had so much criticism of the people who were our partners, who they believed should be perceiving things exactly the way that Ken and Bill did. And I always believed nobody is going to perceive everything the way you do. I mean, that's the nature of a partnership, whether it's in a marriage or among the three of us. But of course, the three of us had so much history at that point, and we knew each other so well. There's kind of a checks and balances situation that comes into play. And, of course, it had taken decades for that to evolve. But Ken and Bill expected that had to happen right away with the other partnerships, whether it was Barney Cohen at DNA or whether it was the Ryco guys, the rep years. And so it became fairly obvious that those partnerships were doomed almost from the beginning. And I do, and I would often try to sort of express my point of view, and it would be very threatening to either Ken or Bill, and they would become very defensive and very critical of the other guys. So it was obvious to me that there was no point to my trying to say, hey, maybe you're being a little rigid too, which doesn't mean that the other people are 100% right and you're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that we all have to be, give a little bit. And that would be very threatening to them. So I just